What would you do if, in the middle of a brutal snowstorm, you heard desperate scratching at your door and found a half-frozen German shepherd collapsed on your porch? Would you hesitate to let him in, knowing nothing about where he came from or what danger might follow? And what if that dog wasn't alone? What if, by opening your door, you were stepping into a mystery far darker than you ever imagined? This is the true story of one man, a stormy night, and a decision that would change everything. Why did this broken dog come to his cabin? What secret was he hiding behind those haunted eyes? And who was out there, watching, waiting to take him back? Join us in reflecting on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification for more daily stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are watching, for we would love to hear from you. The wind outside roared with a furious intensity, hurling blankets of snow against the walls of my secluded cabin. Winter in the mountains had never been forgiving, but tonight's storm felt especially cruel. I was tucked into my favorite armchair, the fire blazing and illuminating the rustic living room with dancing shadows. The warmth on my face was a welcome contrast to the storm's icy threat. I flipped through a well-worn book, intent on savoring a few peaceful hours before calling a night. Then came a noise that tore me away from the printed page, a faint scraping at the door. At first, I tried to ignore it. In a place like this, nestled among towering pines, sound could be misleading, branches hitting the siding or gusts forcing snow against the porch. But something in the back of my mind kept me alert, a prickling sense that these soft scratches were deliberate. I shut the book and rose from my chair, listening more closely. The sound returned, this time accompanied by a pitiful whine that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. Carefully, I stepped across the creaking floorboards, the fire's glow flickering off the walls. When I opened the door a crack, the cold slammed into me with surprising force, sending a swirl of snow spinning across the threshold. Lying on the porch was a German shepherd, half buried in drifts of icy powder. Its coat looked more white than brown under the clumps of frozen snow that clung to every inch of fur. Eyes wide and desperate, the dog gave a trembling whimper, as though begging for help with its last ounce of energy. My heartbeat thundered with alarm. "Oh my God," I murmured, dropping to my knees in the snow. Without hesitation, I gathered the dog into my arms. The sharp bite of freezing fur against my skin made me realize just how close to hypothermia this poor creature was. Its limbs felt stiff and unresponsive, and I could feel its ribs pressing through a thin layer of matted fur. This was not an animal that had simply wandered off from a caring home. It looked starved and forsaken. Kicking the door shut with my foot, I stumbled inside, carrying the shepherd toward the fireplace. I set it down gently on a thick rug, heart pounding as I scrambled to grab a blanket. The dog's breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and for a second, I feared I was too late. Determination surged inside me. I refused to let this animal slip away into the dark after surviving who knew what in that merciless storm. I wrapped the blanket snugly around the shepherd, then hurried to my kitchen, heart still hammering. Filling a bowl with lukewarm water, I returned to the living room. I dipped a clean towel into the water and began gently wiping away clumps of ice. The dog twitched weakly, its ears flicking in response to my touch. I took that as a good sign, or at least not a fatal one. Every passing minute felt like an hour as I worked to raise its body temperature. I leaned closer and whispered, "Stay with me, buddy." I wasn't sure if the dog could hear or understand, but sometimes speaking aloud helped calm my own nerves. Gradually, the shepherd's breathing steadied, the tension in its body lessened, and I finally allowed myself to hope. I ruffled through a box of emergency supplies, pulling out some leftover chicken broth. Warming it on the stove, I offered the dish as soon as it was lukewarm enough. The dog sniffed tentatively, then lapped up a few mouthfuls. Relief flooded through me. If it could eat, even a little, there was still a chance. I kept kneeling there, encouraging the dog with soothing words and gentle strokes of its patchy fur. Outside, the wind continued to shriek, flinging pellets of snow against the window. Inside, though, a different kind of battle was happening. the fight for this dog's life. My gaze lingered on the shepherd's closed eyes as it settled into a fitful rest. I felt an inexplicable bond with the animal already, as though we were two souls thrown together by the chaos of the storm. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a far deeper story that would change my life in ways I never anticipated. Dawn arrived slowly, and with it came the realization that I wasn't the only one who had struggled through the night. The German shepherd lay curled on the rug, wrapped in 2 layers of blankets near the dying embers of the fire. Its trembling had lessened, replaced by the slow rise and fall of fragile sleep. My old cabin, usually so quiet, now felt imbued with a tenuous hope. Like this rescued animal, and I had forged a fragile alliance against the fierce storm outside. I stepped into the kitchen, rummaging for anything palatable I could offer once the dog woke up again. My mind was still spinning with questions. Who did this dog belong to? Where had it come from? And how had it survived a punishing blizzard? Yet no amount of speculation could answer those questions until the dog regained some strength. Just as I poured a small bowl of chicken broth, I heard a familiar sound that made my heart jolt, a scratching at the door, nearly identical to the noise from the night before. Part of me was convinced it was just the wind. Still, the memory of finding the shepherd on the porch wouldn't let me dismiss it. I placed the bowl on the counter and moved toward the door. Pulling it open a sliver, I was again met with an icy gust. At first, I saw nothing but the glare of snowbanks piled high under the slowly brightening sky. Then I glanced down. A smaller, younger German shepherd stood there, equally frostbitten, its fur matted with clumps of frozen debris. The pup's eyes, round and pleading, tugged at me. "Oh no," I breathed. 2 dogs, both in dire shape, showing up in less than 24 hours? The younger one looked even more fragile, swaying on unsteady legs. I carefully ushered it inside, sealing the door quickly behind us. The frigid air made the dying fire sputter, so I rushed to throw more logs onto the embers. The older shepherd lifted its head at the newcomer, ears twitching. A soft whine passed between them, and something in that moment made me suspect they knew each other. Kneeling down, I stroked the younger dog's ears. They were painfully cold to the touch. Gently, I coaxed the pup into settling near the older shepherd. A faint wag of a tail told me they were relieved to be reunited. My mind raced. This was too much to be a coincidence. 2 malnourished German shepherds had sought refuge on my doorstep in the middle of one of the worst snowstorms in recent memory. Grabbing a second bowl, I filled it with lukewarm broth. The younger dog sniffed it, then lapped it up desperately. The older shepherd watched, occasionally lifting its head as though reassured by the pup's presence. Once the younger dog had eaten, it nestled against the older one, the 2 forming a pitiful but heartwarming tableau. I draped another blanket around them, fighting back the surge of protective instinct welling up in my chest. After making sure both were stable, I decided to investigate. Something must have driven them here. If they were fleeing abuse or had been abandoned, there might be more clues outside. I dressed in heavy boots and a thick coat, braced myself for the cold, and ventured out onto my porch. The storm had largely subsided, leaving only a bitter chill and massive drifts. I scanned the area and spotted fresh paw prints in the snow. 2 sets, as expected, leading from the edge of the forest to my cabin. But there was another set of tracks that didn't belong to a dog. Deep, sharp impressions indicated someone on foot had been out here too. A growing sense of unease gnawed at me. Who else was wandering around in this brutal weather? And why would they be with these dogs, only to leave them to die? My breath plumed in front of me as I followed the footprints a short distance. They led to a scattering of trees, then disappeared under a swirl of freshly fallen snow. With no clear trail left, I returned to the cabin, unsettled but determined. Inside, the dogs were dozing, but the younger one flicked an ear when I stepped in. I noticed the older shepherd shift slightly, positioning its body protectively around the smaller canine. Their bond was obvious, even in exhaustion. I sank down onto a chair, boots still caked with snow, and tried to plan my next move. They were alive, at least, and, for the moment, safe. However, the footprints in the snow had triggered all sorts of concerns. These dogs hadn't simply gotten lost. They had come from somewhere, or someone, who might still be out there. I glanced at the older shepherd's scars, faint lines that marred its otherwise majestic coat. Those marks were no random accident. Something told me there was a story behind them that I was only beginning to unravel. Sunlight crept through the weather-beaten shutters, revealing the new day in an uneasy hush. The worst of the storm had ended, leaving a crystalline world outside where the trees stood frozen like silent sentinels. My two unexpected guests, the older German shepherd and the younger one, dozed near the fireplace. Occasionally, they would twitch or let out a muffled whimper, as though dreaming of whatever hardships they'd experienced. I decided I couldn't simply wait around in uncertainty. If someone had been wandering these woods alongside the dogs, I needed to understand what was going on. Perhaps they were in trouble, or maybe they were responsible for the dog's condition. Either way, questions wouldn't answer themselves, and the footprints outside had offered a single clue. I layered myself in warm clothes once more, ensuring the dogs were comfortable with a fresh stack of wood on the fire and bowls of warm broth for when they woke. Then I ventured out into the frosty morning, each breath hanging in the air. I followed the faint path of tracks toward the edge of the forest. The snow was already shifting, wind sweeping over drifts and gradually erasing any signs of disturbance. Those footprints brought me to a small clearing ringed by tall pines. It didn't take long to notice scuff marks in the snow, as though someone and the dogs had been in a struggle. Paw prints looped around one another, and there was a deeper impression where it looked like a body had fallen. My stomach churned at the possibility that something violent had happened here. I knelt down, running a gloved hand across the icy indentations. A flash of color caught my eye. A frayed piece of leash lay partially buried in the snow. My throat tightened. The leash's edges were ragged, as though it had been chewed through. Maybe the dogs had freed themselves, or someone else had cut it. Anger flared as I imagined the circumstances under which these animals might have been restrained. It gave weight to the scars on the older dog's body. Just then, I heard a faint sound behind me, like the soft crunch of snow under cautious steps. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw only swaying branches and gently falling flakes. My nerves were frayed, the quiet forest unnervingly tense. Deciding not to push my luck further, I pocketed the torn leash and retraced my steps. Back at the cabin, the dogs were awake, both staring at the door as though waiting for my return. The older one shifted unsteadily to a standing position, head tilting slightly when it saw me enter. I offered a small smile. "You wouldn't believe what I found out there," I muttered, more to myself than to the shepherd. The dog gazed back solemnly, as though it understood. I set the piece of leash on the table. Next to the battered flashlight I'd dropped the night before. The detail nagged at me. These animals were once tied up, or at least controlled. Why abandon them in a blizzard? And if not abandoned, then what else could have happened? Determined to unravel the truth, I took a moment to examine the older dog more closely. Its eyes, dark and vigilant, seemed to hold a story I wished it could tell. The younger dog, still timid, hovered nearby. Whenever I approached, it would back away slightly, but never left the older dog's side for long. I busied myself preparing a little more food. Warm chicken broth was the safest bet for their fragile states. As the older dog drank, I noticed it occasionally glancing toward the windows, ears perked. Was it expecting someone? Or was it simply reacting to the strange environment of my cabin? Night fell again all too soon, ushering in a sharp drop in temperature. While this new snowfall was gentler, it still blanketed the landscape in white. I stoked the fire, kept the cabin as cozy as possible, and checked on the dogs repeatedly. My mind spun with uneasy thoughts about what might lurk beyond the tree line. Before heading to bed, I paused by the fireplace, where the two shepherds lay curled against each other. The younger dog's tail wagged faintly when I knelt to smooth the blanket over them. The older dog gently rested its muzzle on my knee, and for a moment I felt an emotional weight that took me by surprise. It was gratitude, or perhaps a plea not to be left alone. I whispered, "You're safe here." Maybe it was wishful thinking. Yet I had a strong conviction that the dogs and I were caught in something bigger than just a random encounter on a stormy night. The footprints, the leash fragment, and the dog's battered appearance suggested an unsettling truth that I was no longer willing to overlook. As I drifted off to the steady crackle of the fire, I felt a looming certainty. Answers lay somewhere in the silent forest, waiting to be uncovered. Morning arrived with a pale, ghostly light filtering through the tall pines. The air was so still it felt like holding one's breath, as if the forest itself anticipated some revelation. After ensuring the dogs had fresh water and a bit of food, I took my flashlight and ventured out once more, drawn by a nagging curiosity I couldn't ignore. The torn leash in my pocket felt like a clue pointing me further into the depths of the woods. It didn't take long to pick up where I'd left off. The scuffled clearing looked as eerie in the morning light as it had the day before. Beyond that, I spotted a narrow trail, barely discernible under the new layer of snow. Something told me to follow it. My breath came in visible puffs as I moved quietly among the towering trunks. After trekking for what felt like ages, I came upon a ramshackle structure, an old shed, sagging under the weight of snow on its roof. It looked abandoned, with wooden planks warped by years of harsh weather. My gut twisted at the sight, a sense of dread urging me to turn back. But I pressed on, stepping closer, compelled to learn the truth. As I inched open the door, the rusted hinges emitted a piercing squeal. The inside was dim, and the air stank of old rot. When the light from outside finally reached the interior, I froze at the sight of several metal cages lining the walls. Most were tipped over, their doors hanging open. The floor was littered with scraps of fur, broken bowls, and shredded blankets. A wave of horror passed over me as I realized what this implied. Someone had been keeping dogs here, likely for a sinister purpose. My flashlight beam caught a reflection on a table in the corner. Moving closer, I discovered a battered notebook. Its cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age and stained by water or worse. With trembling hands, I flipped through the entries. Dates, short notes about canine breeds, references to obedience and training, and even mentions of potential sales. The words read like documentation of a horrible operation, animals treated as object for profit. A whimper pulled my attention to the doorway. I turned to find the older German shepherd standing there, fur bristling, eyes locked on the cages. I hadn't realized it had followed me. Heart pounding, I lowered the flashlight, suddenly aware of how personal this place must be to the dog. It barked once, a sharp sound of distress or anger. I knelt beside the dog, gently placing a hand on its shoulder. "This is where you came from, isn't it?" I whispered. The dog's gaze lingered on the cages, then shifted to me with an expression that seemed almost haunted. My chest tightened with sympathy and anger. As I slipped the notebook into my jacket, a faint shuffle outside made me jump. Was someone else here? The dog stepped protectively in front of me, issuing a low growl. Adrenaline fueled my courage as I peered through a crack in the old wood. At first, I could see only trees and an expanse of snow. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. A dark figure stood some distance away, partially hidden among the branches. They seemed to be watching. My heart drummed a staccato beat as I realized we were no longer alone in this clearing. The figure shifted, and I heard the crunch of footsteps retreating. Whoever it was, they disappeared as silently as they'd appeared. The German shepherd nudged me, as if urging me to move. I couldn't have agreed more. Clutching the notebook, I hurried out of the shed, the dog trotting at my side. My mind reeled with questions. Who was that person? Why keep these dogs locked up? And how many others had there been? By the time we returned to the cabin, exhaustion and dread weighed on me heavily. The younger dog greeted us nervously, sniffing the older dog as if to check for injuries. I crouched beside them both, head swirling with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to call for help immediately, but living off-grid made that difficult. Still, I was determined to contact the authorities or at least gather solid evidence first. I flipped through the notebook again, scanning pages filled with callous references to subject numbers and market values. My jaw tightened at the cruelty implied. Glancing over at the older shepherd's scarred flank, I felt a surge of protectiveness. These animals had endured something truly monstrous. The older dog settled beside me, letting out a low breath that sounded almost like a sigh. I was struck by how quickly it had learned to trust me, perhaps out of desperation at first, but now there was a quiet camaraderie. I sensed this dog held a spirit too strong to break, and I resolved not to let my own fear overshadow the growing bond we shared. Despite my remote location, I managed to place a call to the local authorities on my old satellite phone. The line crackled with static, but I was able to convey enough about the notebooks, cages, and the dire state of the 2 German shepherds in my care. An officer assured me they would come as soon as possible, though the storm-lashed roads meant it wouldn't be immediate. As evening fell, a tense hush settled over the woods. I kept the dogs close, occasionally pausing by the window to peer into the darkness. The forest was quiet now, almost too quiet. The older shepherd, who I had come to call Hero in my mind, seemed restless. Every so often, he would bark into the silence, as though sensing a presence I couldn't see. I stoked the fire, trying to quell my own unease, when Hero rose abruptly and padded to the door, staring at it with rigid posture. The younger dog followed suit, but stayed a step behind, uncertain. My heart thumped. It was the same tension I'd felt in the shed that morning. Grabbing a flashlight, I inched the door open. I expected the brute force of the cold, but I hadn't expected to see a human figure standing a short distance away in the dim moonlight. The man wore a heavy coat with the hood pulled up, concealing most of his face. My instincts screamed danger. He stepped closer, and Hero let out a menacing growl. The man's voice broke the hush. "I want what's mine," he snarled, glancing pointedly at Hero and the younger shepherd. My stomach turned, realizing this must be the person behind the shed, the one documented in that sickening notebook. "They're not yours," I said, my voice catching. "You abused them. I found your cages." "Quiet," he snapped, lunging forward. Hero responded instantly, placing himself between the man and me. The dog barked, teeth bared, refusing to yield. The man stumbled back, clearly not expecting such a fierce reaction. Shaking with adrenaline, I aimed my flashlight at him. "I've called the authorities. You're done hurting these animals." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features, but then his expression hardened. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, voice quivering with rage or fear, maybe both. He reached inside his coat for something, but Hero advanced another step, muzzle wrinkling in a deep growl. Desperate to prevent a violent escalation, I raised my free hand. "Just leave," I warned, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you come any closer, I won't hold this dog back." For a brief second, the man's posture seemed to soften, like he was reconsidering his approach. Then, in a sudden, reckless burst of movement, he lunged again. Hero leaped forward, snapping at the air as a warning. That was enough to drive the man into a panicked retreat. He tripped over a snowbank, scrambled to his feet, and tore off into the darkness of the trees. Hero hesitated, as if contemplating a chase, but eventually returned to my side, sides heaving with tension. I stood there, my heart racing, flashlight beam quivering against the snow. The younger dog pressed against Hero's flank, whimpering softly. I let out a long, shaky breath, grateful that we had avoided actual violence. Within the hour, the authorities arrived. 2 officers, bundled in thick winter gear, carefully combed the immediate area, though the man had fled. They took photos of the tracks and listened intently to my account. I showed them the shed, the cages, and handed over the incriminating notebook. Their grim faces told me enough. We were dealing with a criminal operation of dog abuse and possible trafficking. They promised a thorough investigation and asked me to hold on to the German shepherds until they could be placed in proper care, if that was even necessary. Secretly, I already knew I wanted to keep them. I told the officers I'd be responsible for them as long as needed. They agreed, taking down my information. After they left, The tension still lingered in the cold night air. But for the first time, I felt a sense of resolution. Hero had stood his ground for both of us. In that moment, I named him out loud, Hero. The dog cocked his head as if listening. It was fitting, given his bravery and the unwavering loyalty he'd shown from the moment he stepped into my life. That night, with the authorities finally alerted and the criminals soon to be pursued, I sat on the floor beside Hero and the younger shepherd. They seemed calmer, as though they sensed we were finally safe. I draped a worn blanket over my knees, letting my hand rest on Hero's sturdy shoulders. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds being the gentle crackle of the fire and the faint sigh of wind against the window. In the weeks that followed, the authorities expanded their investigation, uncovering more details about the cruel operation that had turned Hero and the younger shepherd into prisoners. Though the man who appeared at my door remained at large for a while. Mounting evidence and renewed efforts by law enforcement eventually led to multiple arrests, shutting down a larger network of illegal dog breeding and abuse. Hero and the younger shepherd stayed with me through it all. The younger one never fully lost a certain skittishness, but both dogs blossomed once they understood they were safe. Regular meals, gentle training sessions, and the freedom to roam the forest around the cabin gave them a sense of normalcy they likely had never known. Each day, Hero demonstrated traits that reminded me why I had chosen that name: courage, loyalty, and a protective instinct that never wavered. Whether standing guard at the door on a frosty morning or lying at my feet while I read by the fire, he was a constant presence of quiet strength. The younger dog, though more timid, mirrored Hero's trust in me over time. Their bond was unbreakable, and they became a testament to the resilience of animals who endure unimaginable hardship, yet still find a way to love. Their story underscores a greater truth about second chances for both animals and humans. We often discover the best parts of ourselves when we choose to help those in need. By standing beside Hero, I found renewed faith in the possibility of compassion overcoming cruelty. Even in the face of danger and uncertainty, hope can thrive if we remain steadfast and refuse to turn away.